From high unemployment to people withdrawing their savings from banks, a country defaulting on its national debt can end up being a major disaster. Governments have increased their debts by $10 trillion in 2021, with government's debt loads expected to pass $92 trillion by the end of the year. Many countries operate under a deficit, but what happens when they can't pay their debts? From Iceland's $85 billion default to Argentina's repeated financial crises, a country being unable to pay back investors can severely lower standards of living and have ripple effects on the entire global economy. This is what really happens when a country goes bankrupt. Like a person, a country has its expenses and income. It spends money on things like infrastructure and social welfare and makes money from taxes. A country can be in surplus or deficit. To find out how well a country is doing if it has a deficit, we can look at the debt to global domestic product or GDP ratio. The country with the current highest ratio is Japan at 257%. Their national debt is about $9 trillion, more than twice their annual GDP. But fortunately, Japan's national debt is largely owned domestically. A high debt to GDP ratio is harder to deal with when that money is owed externally. To deal with a deficit, a country will borrow money through sovereign bonds, debt that's bought and sold on financial markets. What the country owes is referred to as its national debt, or sovereign debt. Investor confidence that the borrowing country will pay back that money is dependent on a few things, like economic climate and political stability. Agencies like Moody's, S&P, and Fitch rate countries based on that confidence. One of the countries with an extremely low rating is Argentina, with C's across the board, which means the country is valued as a risk. To slow its debt, a country needs a budget surplus, but it can be an uphill battle if they can't pay existing bonds without issuing new ones. When this spirals out of control, they declare bankruptcy, which for a country is referred to as defaulting. There are a few leading causes of bankruptcy, like poor monetary policy, history of fiscal irresponsibility, political conflict, and the deterioration of key economic sectors. Jamaica's default on its $7.9 billion loan in 2010 was due to government overspending and the deterioration of tourism. Another example is how Ukraine's conflict with Russia has put Ukraine in a position where it has to repay about $11 billion during the first half of 2021, then an additional $10 billion during the rest of 2021. Borrowing funds is costly for countries with poor credit ratings. While a 10-year U.S. National Treasury note has an annual yield of 2.16%, the yields on 10-year Greek government bonds reached 29% in 2012, just before the country defaulted on an almost $300 billion debt. Meanwhile, countries like the US and Canada have never defaulted on their debt. So a country can't pay back its debt and defaults. What happens next? A country going bankrupt is different from a corporation or person. There are laws in place to help the companies and creditors recoup losses. In the past, if countries could not pay their debts, assets could sometimes be taken forcefully. Now, court battles are the norm. But when a country defaults, there's no international court to go to. A country's assets can no longer be forcefully taken unless those assets are abroad. In 2012, an Argentinian ship was impounded in Ghana because of Argentina's debt. So why do countries even pay off their debt? Well, if countries default, they can be cut off from future access to credit, and countries almost always need funding to continue their growth. It doesn't help that the aftermath of a default can be massive. In 2001, Argentina announced they couldn't pay their debts, so people flocked to banks to withdraw their money. There were protests, mobs, and the president fled. It's not uncommon for stock markets to be wiped of 50% of their market capitalization, for governments to shut down banks, or for the exchange rate to plummet as everyone sells their currency for more stable foreign currency. Foreign creditors may even convince other countries to impose trade embargoes. But there are ways to make a default less painful. In 2008, the main Icelandic banks failed and the government refused to bail them out of a massive $85 billion debt. Currency crashed, unemployment soared, and the stock market was almost wiped out. Policymakers took bailouts from the International Monetary Fund. They provided financial resources and technical expertise, which allowed Iceland to build and protect social support programs and forgive homeowner debt. They ended up getting $4.6 billion from the IMF and other investors to rebuild their economy. The IMF is a good place to go when a country reaches the point of default. When the Greek economy crashed in 2009, they went to the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission, who issued bailouts worth more than 240 billion euros, or 350 billion US dollars. But bailouts come with conditions, like deep budget cuts and steep tax increases. Greece had to streamline its government and end tax evasion in its country. Most defaulting countries try to restructure their debt instead. These are called haircuts, where the original value of a bond is reduced. After its $81 billion default in 2001, Argentina offered to pay its creditors a third of what it owed them. But what effects does bankruptcy have on a country's population? Let's look at the US. Its national debt is over $27 trillion, but as a debt-to-GDP ratio, it's a reasonable 133%. However, if the US were to go bankrupt, experts hypothesize that the following could happen. Life savings would be worth almost nothing. Government benefits would disappear. Things like food stamps, Medicare, Social Security. Taxes would increase by as much as 50%. A lower standard of living will occur from businesses closing, which means more unemployment. Violence, stealing, and general crime will increase as desperate people take desperate measures. Countries that have already defaulted haven't been able to pay salaries, and a negatively viewed economy means less product consumption. As a result, the GDP plummets and continues the unemployment cycle. As for how bankruptcy of one country affects the rest of the world, the most significant upcoming blow that could shake the global financial system is Turkey's possible default. With $300 billion of external debt, the country's bankruptcy would be followed by a chain reaction in economies all over the world. This is because a bankrupt country may not be able to continue its trade relationships with other countries. The money it owes to foreign nations may never be paid, and both domestic and international banks can lose money. Other countries can also suffer because of a tightening of financial conditions, like spikes in interest rates or trade and economic slowdowns. This is even more true for large countries or those linked with the global economy, like Turkey. But sometimes a default can be the best option. In 2017, experts compared Iceland's crisis to its position after recovery. Iceland's GDP was $24.49 billion for a population of 343,400 people, which translates to $71,311 GDP per capita, much higher than the US's $59,958 in the same year. But bankruptcy could keep happening if these countries don't catch up or maintain momentum. It looked promising, but Argentina went bankrupt again in May 2020 by failing to pay $500 million on its due date to its creditors. It managed to reduce its payments in the next decade by $37 billion, but it will be difficult to keep repeating this process. Negotiations are still ongoing for the restructuring of its remaining $66 billion debt. Government debt is about $92 trillion US dollars, but what about the entire world's debt? The debt held by all people, companies, and governments is an astonishing $281 trillion US dollars, and it's set to rise again in 2021.